I've written before about educational buzzwords, and there's a real liability with their use. One is that educational theorists, enamoured with neologisms, can tend to co-opt already well-defined concepts, redefine them, and subject them to a certain species of what could be called educational lock-in. Lock-in is where, unintentionally, a design feature has some negative effect upon future potentials for growth. The polymath philosopher, scientist and technologist Jaron Lanier uses the example of the London Underground train system, which lacks air conditioning. Built at a time when air conditioning wasn't possible on trains, now that it is possible, the tubes simply aren't large enough for the exhaust required to accommodate air conditioning systems. So, for now at least, passengers are locked in to a hot and uncomfortable system most months of the year. In education, sometimes we can define into being terminology that defines future directions in teaching, and this constrains options for what might be learned and how. For example, does calling certain activities critical and creative thinking techniques lock in how we might think clearly about these ideas? I'm concerned we're headed down the wrong track, and before we get too far, I want to pull the brakes and consider whether, metaphorically speaking, we might not want to widen the tunnel to accommodate some better ideas about what these terms mean. Critical and creative thinking are ways to generate knowledge. And how knowledge is generated is the domain of a particular area of philosophy called epistemology. Epistemology is one of the most interesting and yet least well understood subjects within philosophy. People who know a little about philosophy, or perhaps have very little interest in it, can be dismissive of the whole project at times because they think it is largely concerned with moral philosophy or ethics, or metaphysics and ontology. That's a concern about what really exists and what ultimately there is to know. And that everything within philosophy is little more than some mere matter of opinion. But this is false. For example, the central question within epistemology of how we can come to have reliable knowledge of the world is no mere matter of opinion. It makes objective difference to how well we can make progress as to what this answer is. And this is what epistemology really is. It's literally the theory of knowledge as it's defined in analytical philosophy. And in this area of philosophy, there really is a best theory that we should strive to understand. Now, not all of what is called philosophy or marches under that banner is interesting or even useful, but much is worth preserving and trying to learn more about, not least of which is epistemology as it's relevant to learning, the subject of this present piece. Epistemology, as it's currently best understood, can help us to have an optimistic view of humanity and life. And if you want a well-rounded idea of philosophy, you should probably also include some philosophy of science if you want to understand how scientific knowledge in particular grows. Now, returning to our definition of epistemology as the theory of knowledge, we can rephrase it without any loss of meaning whatever to epistemology is the explanation of the growth of knowledge. And this growth of knowledge can happen as a civilisation, or it can happen as a society or a small community, or it can even happen inside the single mind of a learner. The remarkable thing is that the processes, it turns out, are the same. Now let me explain. There are two absolutely crucial aspects to the growth of knowledge: creativity and criticism. Now, in educational circles, the terms critical and creative thinking have migrated away from how they have largely and precisely been used in the more rarefied spheres where they have been genuine domains of study, controversy and progress over the decades, especially within epistemology. The terms now are synonymous not with thinking as such, but rather with certain teaching strategies that are more or less fashionable amongst some educators and some educational theorists. I wish to quickly admit that it's more or less well known that there's a world of difference between a teaching strategy and a learning strategy. It is safe to say that almost all strategies used by teachers to teach students are the former, not the latter. Teaching strategies, ways of organising schoolwork or ideas on paper, ways of having students respond to questions or complete tasks. Whether they stand up and move around a class, sit down and do the work quietly, speak or not speak, draw pictures or write words. Indeed, the very behaviours typically promoted by theorists and cultivated in classes by teachers, these are teaching strategies. Almost everything ever covered in any professional development course or a university-level teacher training course completed by teachers and ostensibly labelled a learning strategy is a teaching strategy. Learning strategies are very difficult to come by. And that is because learning happens best in a free environment where coercion is just not part of the picture and someone else isn't choosing for you how best to learn. So it happens to be the case that one can deploy every teaching strategy in the countless teaching handbooks and websites and seminars ever deployed, and learning can still be elusive. Why? Because simply naming something, say 9 hats for better thinking, does not mean it is genuinely about thinking. Labelling something does not make it so. Thinking is always a creative process constrained by careful criticism. What happens in the mind of an individual learner is that they guess or conjecture what might be true, what might work, and then they criticise this idea. If the idea survives a criticism, then they regard themselves as having learnt it. They conditionally regard it as true. However, educational theorists love neologisms. Educational theorists think that if they come up with a neologism, they have actually invented a new idea. Typically, what they have done is either just label some common sense or some older idea, or adapted some pre-existing set of ideas for the purpose of naming it a teaching strategy or a learning strategy. And the theorist often gives these a name that may sound very scientific. Sometimes it can be fun. For example, you might want to encourage students to become a physics brain, an idea I came up with some years ago. Think of something about a given topic that B bugs you, then also something that you can R reflect on, and A, another idea related to the one under study. Find something I interesting and something N negative. You can make up your own acronym. There are many such things. Now, on my own R reflection, I realised this scheme, far from organising thoughts, can tend to restrict them. What we really needed was true criticism and creativity, if that's what we're interested in trying to learn. So how should it work? Critical and creative thinking begins with a criticism. You should criticise. What don't you understand? What is wrong? Get to the heart of it. Then create. Can you improve on this? Can you think of a new idea superior to the one that you've criticised? If you can, then that new idea is the one that you should regard as being true. If you can't, and there is an idea that you don't have a criticism of, then you should regard that one as true. And so, in learning now, I've tended to avoid ways of organising thoughts, because minds just don't work that way, and nor should they. Now, there are exceptions to this. For example, if your entire objective is that you want to pass an exam, then perhaps yes. If that's your goal, passing exams, all those many mnemonics and tricks and techniques, they can seem to work for some. But we must be careful to separate. Passing exams is not the same as critical and creative thinking. Passing exams is about adhering as closely as possible to someone else's ideas of what the correct way to think is. It's anti-critical. It is not very good objecting to questions in an exam while you're having one. It's no good taking issue with the premise of a question. Some people might. The best students might take a risk. Most will not. Why not? Well, why should they? Examinations and assessment tasks in education are generally antithetical to anything but adhering to or rising to meet defined outcomes, things already thought through. It is thus not only anti-critical, it's anti-creativity. Exams and assessment tasks are not about new ideas. They're about showing that you have grasped old ideas, the ideas that have been taught. See the problem? So let us, right now, return to basics. Let us consider what is meant by critical and creative thinking and see if these can help us learn. First, true critical and creative thinking are the very means by which we learn. Indeed, they are the only means. They are the whole story. But do we understand the whole story? No. Do we understand anything? Yes, of course, quite a bit. We have some very good ideas, some very true ideas. We understand a lot about critical thinking, but not quite so much about creative thinking. So in part 2, I'm going to explain a little bit about what we know about critical thinking.